Welcome to Akdang Buhay series, Likhaan, University of the Philippines, Institute of Creative Writing. We're now in the 10th year and we're lucky to have this time around the poet Simeon Dumdum Jr. Sir Jun, thank you for saying yes to this interview. Sir Jun, can you tell us about life before writing came to you? And I understand you were in the seminary and then you went back to the country to study law. Can you talk about this whole transition and even further back, Sir Jun?
Yes, Jan, I was born in Balamban, Cebu. I'm 75 years old now. My father was a school teacher, my mother a housewife. I studied in Balamban for elementary and high school. And after that, I went to the seminary of the Redemptorist congregation in Iloilo. I spent a year there learning Latin, and the next year I was in Bacolod for the novitiate. Well, eventually I became a member of the Redemptorist congregation. I was sent to Ireland for my seminary studies. I stayed there for 3 years. And it was actually in Ireland when I started writing poems. But then, let me continue. I came back to the Philippines, and I left the seminary and took up law, working at the same time with the Department of Public Information. This was during martial law. And I became a lawyer and practiced law for 15 years, and then joined the judiciary. I stayed in the judiciary for almost 15 years and retired. All along I was writing, but not too much because, the pressures of raising a family and working as a judge did not give me enough time and reflection to write poems. While in the judiciary, I contracted cancer, colon cancer, stage 3. And the doctor told my wife when I was undergoing chemotherapy to keep me busy. Now, I had a project before that, and it was about writing poems about birds, using the different verse forms. And during my chemotherapy, I resumed that. And it was part of my healing. I would write 2 poems a day. And when my chemotherapy ended, I had written 129 poems about birds. 129 birds, 129 verse forms, different verse forms. Villanelle, sestina, sonnets, haiku, tanka, the whole caboodle.
We'll touch on them specifically later, Sir Jun. But I want to go back. What happened to the resolve to become a priest?
Well, after 3 years in the seminary, this was the major seminary taking up philosophy. The fathers recalled us and we came back and they put us in a seminary in Manila, Mary Hill Seminary. But I stayed there for only 1 year because it's not because of women, but because of poetry. Because during our classes in the seminary, San Carlos Seminary in Guadalupe, I would sneak out and go to the library and read poetry books. I wasn't interested in theology anymore, especially since the professors we were too many. The professor was using a microphone. There was a lack of personal connection. So because of that, I think I left the seminary.
Mm-hmm. In one of your interviews, you happened to have this conversation or an argument with someone about the importance of poetry in life. I've read that. Can you talk about that particular incident?
Yes. In Ireland, you see, Ireland is a land of, somebody describes it as a land of priests, poets, and alcoholics. A lot of poets in Ireland. And at that time, a young teacher from Belfast named Seamus Heaney came up with his first book, Death of a Naturalist, and which I liked very much. But then a confrere, an Irish seminarian who was always talking about poetry, we had a walk together, and I said, why don't we debate? What use is poetry? Poetry is useless. And so we had an argument, friendly argument, and I think I lost that argument. So that came to my mind, maybe I should try writing poems. And one day we went to the beach on Galway Bay, and I saw a sandbar. Sandbar would disappear when the tide was up and appear again when the tide was down. So I wrote a small poem about this sandbar, and I sent it to an Irish magazine called Hibernia. I don't know if it still exists, but it accepted the poem, and I was paid a guinea. Now, a guinea was £1 and 1 shilling. It's no longer currency in the United Kingdom. So that was it. That started me on writing poems.
But I suppose it's a different story. I mean, falling in love with poetry and then writing. I suppose those are two different stories altogether. I mean, it was the love for literature that came first, and then the writing came after.
Yes, because in the seminary I read literature books. The very first novel I read was there, To Kill a Mockingbird, and then I read Dr. Zhivago, and one seminarian read Lady Chatterley's Lover, but he changed the covers, and instead of Lady Chatterley's Lover, he got a cover that said God's divine life or something like that, as a disguise. Yes, my love for literature. And then it kind of naturally transitioned to poetry.
Tell us about those moments. I suppose magical moments when you started writing poetry. Your very first poems. Can you describe that? Because I'd like to think that those moments pretty much played very crucial role when you. I mean, that really is launched an entire decades of writing poetry. Can you describe these moments of discovering poetry?
Yes, what I discovered was that when I was able to write a poem that satisfied me, I felt happy and joyful, and especially after my first poem was published in Hibernia, and I was paid a guinea. And not only that, the community, because normally we would eat quietly, lunch, dinner, breakfast quietly, while someone read a holy book. But then, when there was an occasion to celebrate, the rector would say, let's just have a colloquium. So, because of my poem, I was granted, or the community was able to celebrate by talking, no longer keeping silent. And now, I had another poem which I sent to Hibernia and which came out. Already I was in the Philippines, and the payment still a guinea. I used to buy a guitar. Now you might think that I played the guitar. No, I just wanted to buy a guitar, And now, so that was it. And when I was in Manila in a seminary, I sent some poems to the Free Press, which came out. And the fact that the Free Press published my poems, at that time the editor was Nick Joaquin. That was a big thing. So the happiness, the feeling of fulfillment, these were ecstatic. So that actually kept me on the road of writing poems.
And at that time, some women swooned over your poem.
I don't know about that because, when I began writing, I was in the seminary.
These were not love poems, Sir John. These were not love poems.
No,
Yeah.
they were not love poems.
They were about what?
They were about leaves. They were about the death of a 5-year-old, and about sleep. So, not love poems. I wasn't in love then. Later, yes.
Okay. And you used poetry to win over the love of your life?
No, but my wife actually liked poetry, and that was one of the things that got us together. But no, I never used poetry to woo a woman because they would not understand. I think they would much prefer poems like Rolando Carbonell, Beyond Forgetting. So, but that wasn't my style of poetry.
You have now over 70 years of writing poetry. Can you talk about the evolution, I mean the progression, some changes perhaps in terms of themes, preoccupations, or maybe the creative process?
Yeah, it's a long career, and when I began, I didn't know anything about writing poetry. I just relied on my instincts, whatever you might understand by them, of what I thought was a poem. So in the beginning, whenever I saw something, my nephew playing with Beatles, uh, putting up or setting up the room, whatever, I would write about it. But of course, I would wait for inspiration, what the Japanese would call the kireji, the intuition, without which I would not write a poem. Like when I wrote a poem, I saw someone carrying a cat on his shoulder. Now, normally you don't carry a cat on your shoulder, you carry a parrot. So I wrote a poem about that, entitled Why There Are No Cats in the Forest. So that kind of thing. But then, when martial law came and I was ready for my second collection, Third World Opera, my poems evolved into a commentary on the political and social conditions. And I think the poem Third World Opera was the beginning of a political perspective. That poem was included by Alfredo Navarro Salanga in his anthology on martial law poems, verses.
Yeah, I was about to ask you how. Your creative early beginnings as a creative writer, as a poet, happened at a time in our country when it was politically charged. No? So I was about to ask you how you responded to that as a poet.
Yes, it was difficult not to write about politics then. You could not close your eyes. And so that poem, Third World Opera, and others, there were others. Some are smarter than others, and especially later, because my later poems would not run away from commenting on the events like bombings and like the environment and so on. I tackled all of them together with love, of course, and time and the human condition.
How much bravery did it take you to write those political poems? I mean, at the time when it was, we were under, kind of different rule.
It varies. It varied. Some poems would come very easily. Others, I would have to wait and think of the lines. Some easy, some hard. But I always made sure that the poem would have a line that would clinch it. and make it memorable.
Yeah, but this was martial law period, right? I mean,
Yes.
And were you afraid to kind of rock the boat with your poetry?
No, because I changed a few things, like in Third World Opera, the governor, instead of the governor, I was referring to the governor of Metro Manila, of course, a lady. So I changed the governor to a man. Yes, and the thing is, it's not actually a noisy kind of poem, because it has humor and irony, and people reading it would know who I mean, but not like, unlike the usual political poems, they were really hard hitting and noisy and confrontational. No.
The poet's attention to detail, Sir June, I mean, that apparently is your gift, I'd like to believe. So can you tell us about it?
It's true, John, and it's not just the poet, it's the fiction writer too, who has to, as they say, put in the furniture. And a poem has to, because a poem is both image, sound, and meaning. And the image has to be exact. And any references must be accurate. So when I write about a flower, I cannot just say a sunflower. I cannot just guess it or write about without researching. I have to research. And especially like when I wrote about, I have a long poem, Salt and Light, how my wife amounts to me as valuable as salt. And maybe if you tell a woman that, she might get insulted, but I had to prove it, that she is valuable to me as salt. So I had to research, and I realized that salt was very valuable, and it was in fact one of the causes of war, salt. Yeah. And so my wife passing me the salt is valuable to me, and I would go to war for her, and of course light, and I had to research about light. Of course, obviously light is valuable. But then, because the poem has two parts, the second part about light has to be as long, so there was a need for me to research. So research is very important. And when I wrote about the Mass, Mass at the Edge of Morning, a poem of 1,337 lines. Of course, to reach that length, you just have to research about the Mass, what the gestures of the priest mean, and what is the meaning of consecration, and so on, and what the church means as the body of Christ, and so on. So detail is very important.
But a chair, a fictionist looking at the chair will bring us to the living room or someone who's not there. But for a poet, the chair would take us somewhere else, in another planet. I mean, it takes a certain kind of sensitivity or sensibility. Can you talk about that, Sergeant?
Yes. When I write a poem about a chair, I don't know if I have written about the chair. I should one day. But the chair, I have to describe the chair as a real chair, not as a symbolic chair, a real chair with the style of chair, kind of wood and so on, make it real. And then symbolic, first the physical chair, which should transition into a symbolic chair, and what the chair means on a larger scale, not just describing, but William Carlos Williams, if you remember, he wrote about a wheelbarrow, the red wheelbarrow. So much depends on a red wheelbarrow glazed with rainwater beside the white chickens. That's all. And it's a famous poem. And it's very physical, describing the wheelbarrow glazed with rain and the white chickens. But somehow that image attains a symbolic meaning, the moment. And if you remember Baso, haiku, an old pond, a frog jumps in, the sound of water. That's very physical, sound of water. But then it's a very symbolic haiku. It's the temporary in the eternal, the moment, and the eternal, the momentary in the eternal.
And then the transitory and the
Transitory
permanent.
and the permanent.
Yeah. As the practice of law and poetry writing fed on each other?
As a lawyer, I didn't write any poems connected to my lawyering. But as a judge, I wrote about 3 or 4. And I recall I wrote a poem about a witness testifying, and then suddenly a bird outside sang, and I told myself, that's a better witness. Another time I wrote a poem about a German shepherd who was trained to ferret out the truth. And if the witness began telling a lie, when a person tells a lie, he sweats. And the German shepherd starts barking, I would know that the witness was telling a lie. So there was another one, but yes, my work and my poetry, they blend, they influence each other, because somehow that's life, that's me, a lawyer, a judge.
I understand you also had awarded for the best decision. Was it something? Can you talk about it, Sir Jun?
Yes, in 2005, the Supreme Court gave me an award. The name of the award is Best Decision in a Criminal Case, Second Level Courts. And it was, in short, a Judicial Excellence Award. I submitted several decisions to the Supreme Court, and they awarded me, I think, for a decision, a short one, but I thought I wrote it quite well, simple English, because the accused, if he is convicted and doesn't know the decision, doesn't understand the decision, that would be double jeopardy. So I always write in simple English. But that decision, I recall, was about a case in which a jealous husband burned the clothes of his wife, and the wife sued him for arson. And you know what? I acquitted the husband. Mm-hmm. And the reason was that arson involves burning a building or part of the building. If you just burn the clothes of the wife, that would be malicious mischief, but not arson. So that was my decision, and it won an award.
So these decisions, Sir Jun, were written in prose. Have you ever entertained the idea of writing fiction inspired by those writings?
No, of course it was written in prose, but because the Supreme Court would punish me if I wrote my decision in verse.
Yeah, but this could have inspired you to do fiction on the other hand.
No, but come to think of it, they would be very good material for fiction.
Yeah.
Yes, the stories, a lot of stories, and very, some of them dramatic, some tragic, Yes, that's right.
And how come, stick to poetry and never Have you ever written fiction, Sir Jun? I mean,
I'm ashamed to admit that I did once, and in fact it was published, but I didn't think it was any good. Yeah, it was about a lizard, but uh, fiction about a lizard is never any good.
what use does poetry have to you in dealing with life? I mean, maybe you can talk about specific instances, Sir Jun.
Yes. Uh, of course, poetry is not something that will feed your family, but it certainly feeds my soul. And it has a humanizing effect on me, on the way I look at the world, because a poet or any writer for that matter can never be cruel, can never be cruel. An author who writes cruelly about a character is not a good author. So when I write about a flower, it's always in praise of the flower, in praise of God who created that flower, and never a poem that criticizes the flower. Imagine you're criticizing a flower. So in that sense, it humanizes me, and I hope that it does the same to the reader. So it's and especially as my concept of poetry evolved, and I began to consider poetry as a kind of prayer, because I could not just write about myself. There are a lot of people who write about themselves, self-referential pieces. Now, I consider a poem successful if it connects with a greater truth, something more than myself, and in my case, God. So, in that sense, the poem is a prayer, is a praise.
But on the other hand, tragedies, no, which also happens in life, which is cruel, also makes good literature. I mean, and it's in very cruel. No? So how do you react to that, Sir Jun?
I write about them, and I draw out from them whatever insights that I find sublimating. I mean, insights that put them in a greater picture. Like when there was a bombing in Hulu, and I wrote a poem from the point of view of a spider, seeing the limbs being strewn about, the blood, and then finally seeing the crucifix, Jesus on it, spattered with blood. And the spider identified itself with no blasphemy meant here, but the spider seeing Jesus, hands outstretched, and the cross, the spider thought that it was a spider too, And so I wrote about them, bombings, and George Floyd in America, remember? He was a black American, and the policeman knelt on his neck and he died. So I wrote about him. I wrote about immigrants crossing the Mediterranean and dying, drowning. And of course I wrote my daughter, second daughter, died in a sea accident in 1997, and I wrote a long poem about her entitled Bolo. It's actually an epic poem based on the Bagubo epic. And while it talks about Leon Kilat, because an epic has to take up the life of a hero, at the same time, I transitioned from Leon Kilat to my daughter, So, Bolo, that's a long poem.
Tell us about the transition. Talk about the transition, Sir Jun, within that poem.
Yes. Now, the concept of a Bagubo poem is there is a narrator, one of the tribe, whose job is to recite epics, And in the process, the narrator speaks of himself, like he might speak of a hero, and then he inserts his own life, his joys, his sorrows, his tragedies, then goes back to the life of the hero. And sometimes, he doesn't finish. He is able only to tell an episode or a part of the epic, not the whole epic. So I use that, like I being the narrator, talking about Likhaan, and then talking about my daughter, dying and so on. And of course, Likhaan dying also in Karkar, and then ending it with the Sinalimba. Sinalimba is a flying boat, which the heroes in the Bagubot tribe take in going to heaven. So in my poem, my daughter, and as well as the others who died, because there were 7 of them who died, rode the Sinalimba with Likhaan, going to heaven. So that's how it ends.
How much in the process of writing that book helped in your grief, in your healing?
It was healing because I was able to pour out my grief, And the poem, happily, did not turn out sentimental, because it had a narrative frame. So it helped me deal with my grief, and yes, it was a healing thing, the poem.
Was it a painful thing to write, Surgeon? Okay, kind of relieving the pain and all that. Was it difficult to write? Emotionally.
It was difficult, but at the same time, I had to do it because, I had to contend with what happened, and then at the same time, look at the event as something with a happy ending somehow, happy ending. As a Christian, of course, the afterlife with Jesus and resurrection, and in that epic, of course, the Sinalimba, going to better land, So in that sense, I was helped in looking at the event from a point of view that held it, raised it to a spiritual level.
I understand you wrote poems for on Duterte, and then later on for Leni Robredo. Can we talk about the circumstances surrounding around those poems?
Yes, in the beginning, I kind of I didn't vote for Duterte, but when he said that he was for federalism, which I am for personally, I looked with favor on him, and even wrote poems about him. And one of the poems was about myself, chancing him in the restroom. So we were passing water together, We didn't talk, but I just reflected on the idea of how this man was considered a killer, was there with me, and both of us doing the very human thing of doing that, passing water in the toilet, But then I changed my mind when I saw that he was not the kind of president that I wanted, especially when he dropped federalism and supported Leni Robredo. And during the campaign of Leni Robredo, I wrote poems for her. And I especially liked the poem I wrote, A Prayer for Leni Robredo.
Which goes something like?
It's a long poem, but if we have time, I can read it.
But what did you say in that particular poem, Sergeant?
It's hard to say because, as Leni Robredo, as someone in touch with the people, like a ray of sun, and going to the homes of the humble, and helping, giving them hope. But it's a long poem, and I like it.
Okay. And Let's talk about your book, Wilderness: A Journey Through Sacred Time, no? Which contains, meditations on faith and being human largely. Um, is Tell us about the moments, no, and inspiration that built this book, Sir Jun.
Yes, the origins of the essays that I wrote, which go into that book, Wilderness, were essays on the Sunday Gospel, which I wrote for Cebu Daily News. Because at that time, I was already a judge. I was forbidden by the Supreme Court to write about secular topics, politics, popular culture. I wasn't allowed. And then, because I bought a car and I had to pay the installments, I thought that I might be able to have money for the installments by writing a Sunday column. This time I used the gospel aspect. And then the Chief Justice read one of my essays and told me that he liked them. He liked it, and so I took that as approval. And so I wrote, actually my style there is, the gospel is related to something in my life, an incident in my life. Like I might see an ambulance and then write about pain, and the Christian idea of pain. And I might see a bicycle man selling pandesal, riding the bicycle and with the pandesal in a basket at his back, going into the village and write about the multiplication of loaves. So that was it. And when I had enough, I collected them into a book called Wilderness.
You had the. Let's talk about your bout with an illness, no? Cancer, Sir John, and tell us about the whole experience and writing amidst that treatment.
In 2009, I was diagnosed with colon cancer, and it was stage 3. And I thought I was going to die. But I had surgery and then had chemotherapy for 6 months. Now, the doctor told my wife, Gingging, who by the way is also a poet, to keep me busy. Because the whole time I was sleeping, feeling very weak. And then I realized that I had a project which I started, but not just began. It was a series of poems about birds using verse, the different verse forms. So I resumed that project and wrote 2 bird poems a day. And by the end of my chemotherapy, I had 129 bird poems using the different verse forms: villanelle, sestina, sonnet, haiku, and the rest, rhyme royale. So they all went into a book called If I Write You This Poem, Will You Make It Fly? So, and it was part of my healing. Because when the project ended, the chemotherapy also ended. And I realized that I was able to bear the discomfort and the nausea and lack of appetite because of my writing of the poems.
And were these kind of meditations on mortality? Because you're having this situation with you at that time.
The bird poems do not deal with mortality and death. They're actually happy poems about birds. And depending now on the characteristic of the bird, if it's silo, your black shama, song, if it's about the doves, fruit doves. So I kind of adapted the style to their behavior, their habitat there. And they're all joyful poems, really.
Yeah, because I was about to ask what brought you to kind of close attention to the creature I mean, what is it about the creature that fascinated you, that you're able to produce this much poems about birds?
Yes, because I had a book, Birds of the Philippines, by Rees and Gonzalez, I think. And I told myself, I counted the birds, 129. Of course, there are more birds in the Philippines than that, but 129, I told myself, okay, I will write about 129 birds. And somehow, when I wrote the poems, in my imagination, I saw them visiting our house, alighting on a branch near our house. And they kind of became alive, and I got to know them. While before, I just knew about the tickling or the maya and so on. Now they became almost human, like having characteristics, having knowledge and even affection, They became human. So that was how they came. The birds came.
Birds suddenly appear. Well, the poet Lawrence Ipil wrote a paper about your poems called Representations of the Unconscious. How would you respond to that essay, Sir Jun?
I did not read that essay closely, but what I feel is he probably considered the poems in The Gift of Sleep. Gift of Sleep, as the title suggests, the poems are set in a world between sleep and waking, Not very specific, doesn't mention, there's a poem there, The Gift of Sleep, of course. But how did that come about? When I was a seminarian in Ireland, one of the seminarians told the prefect, because he could not get up at 4:30 for meditation and mass, he said, "But Father, what if I have the gift of sleep?" And the phrase, the gift of sleep, stayed with me. And then I used that for the book. Also, I was reading then René Char's, French poet, René Char's book, Hypnos Waking. Hypnos is the god of sleep, and that book is a collection of aphorisms. So I thought, wow, that's a good universe for these poems. And those poems, which Larry Ipil wrote about, they're there, they're dreamy, and they seem to occupy or exist in that state,
When we read a Simeon Dumdum Jr. poem, it seems like the moment itself becomes the universe. I mean, kind of a metonymy for far larger things. How would you respond to that, Sir Jun?
That is correct. Because I myself, if I live my life on the surface, work, family, nothing happens. But then when I want to write a poem, I enter another world. It's a different world from the world in which I normally live, So, and that world I put into the poem. It's a world that, say, in which I see a sandal as a sundial, That sandal, that's really a sundial, I kind of adjust my eyes, my thoughts to another world in which sandals are sundials, and I want the reader to experience the same thing. And lately, after a visit to the Holy Land, I wrote sonnets about the different holy shrines, and hoping that the reader would be able to enter these shrines also when he reads the sonnets.
You were like this child who wanted to put the entire ocean into this hole in the by the beach, and that encounter between Saint
Augustine. Yes,
Augustine.
I remember that. Yeah, putting the whole ocean into that hole, an impossible thing, but not when it comes to poetry. Not just the ocean, but, the universe you can put into that whole.
Even more poetic, Sir Jun. Uh, um, I mean, have you ever encountered a kind of challenge? Because, I mean, you're experiencing, or say, for example, you see something, you're confronted by an experience, a local experience, which happens in a particular language, and with a certain thought process, and then converting that into English poetry. I mean, have you ever had that kind of challenge, Sir Jun?
Oh yes, of course. I tried translating some of my poems into Cebuano, like Lipos of the Police. And that translation came out very well, and Edith Tiempo even included it in her anthology. So, in my case, it's not difficult to translate because I write simply. I don't use highfalutin words. So, when I translate, and especially if the event that I am translating is local event, like when I was with my mother and we were cleaning coconut palms, fronds, for fuel, and I wrote a poem about that. So the thought process for the English and for the Cebuano is more or less the same.
I understand you had a work also which you collaborated with Ma'am Gingging, and how was the creative process then? I mean, how were you able to do it?
Gingging, my wife, and I collaborated on a book of Renga. Renga is, of course, Japanese verse form, and the Renga they are really a series of tankas. Tanka was the oldest form of Japanese verse. And then the tanka has five lines. So Gingging wrote the first three, and I wrote the last two. Syllabic, 57577. So what happened was, it was like a journey. She would write the first five lines, and then I'd write the last two, and she would pick it up from there and write the next five lines. And it was like chess. She moves the white, and I move my black, and so it went on until we were able to write 100, and we call it Renga.
Renga. And how did it turn out? I mean, the whole poem. I mean, yeah.
It turned out very well because the flow is smooth, and then surprising because when I wrote the last two lines, it would be a surprise move like in chess, and then she would write the next five lines and another surprise. So there was a dialectical flow, and it was all about going home. The Renga, 100 tankas.
This next question, Sir Jun, is meant for the beginning writers. Kind of tip from a veteran for an experienced writer. How did you deal with the challenges of the genre of poetry writing, Sir Jun?
When I began writing poems, I didn't know how to go about it. What I did was, I read books, poetry, and how to write poems. Fortunately, at that time, there was a USIS library, and the librarian was a relative, so I was able to borrow a lot of books. And whenever I came across a poem I liked, a good poem, I would copy the poem and study it and see how it was successful, how the poet wrote it, and follow it, and imitated it. So until this went on, and of course the books that I borrowed, they were a great help, and until I was able to join a workshop, Shiliman, where I learned how to criticize myself, because in the beginning, I did not criticize myself. I thought that I was good, and the poem that came out was effective. But when I went to the workshop, the first poem that they took up there, Edith Tiempo cut it down to size, so I said, so that's how it is. So I acquired a sense of self-criticism, and that helped. Because then when I write a poem and it's bad, I just throw it away and then try again and be patient.
That's your way of saying workshops help young writers.
In my case, yes, workshops did. I joined the UP Writers Workshop too, and I remember a fellow there who wrote a short story, which Nick Joaquin criticized, and she was crying. She was crying, and Nick Joaquin said, if this is what happens, Nick Joaquin might as well not come back. And he did not come back. And that was the last time he attended a writer's workshop. So it can be painful, a workshop, but if you have the right attitude, you can learn from it.
Here's something you wrote, Sir Jun. I'd like to read it. One dances with the meaning and sound of words, which necessarily one must harness into a theme. No matter how free the verse, the words must trot in tandem, like foxes that, despite their wildness, must keep to a clip-clop on the road of a morning in the country. A poem must dance, a poem must foxtrot, or forever walk as prose. Beautiful words there, Sir Jun. Tell us about this in prose.
Yes, Paul Valery said, in prose we walk, in poetry we dance. But then, whether I write poetry or prose, I always pay attention to the arrangement of words, to the sound of words. I read the sentence and check for myself whether they have the right tone. I especially have as model Herman Melville's Moby Dick, the beginning, call me Ishmael, how gracefully the sentence comes. And I discovered that happens if you use active words, active voice. If you use the active voice, the sentences come out better. If you use the passive voice, I always know that the author is a scholar doing his dissertation, because it's always a passive voice, but I also know the writer is a creative writer if he uses the active voice. That's what I do. Look at the words, how they appear on paper, and listen. I listen. The ear is very important.
Are there still poems you want to write, Sir Jun?
While I'm alive and still think and write, I will write poems, because poetry is life. Wherever I go, I always see a possibility of a poem. When Gingging, my wife, and I go to the sea, Il Curso, and have coffee, and I see the boats there, there's a poem. So always, I cannot say what poems I write, because they happen. They are what Jose Garcia Villa calls accidental pregnancy and not planned parenthood.